Hi, welcome to our next lecture, and where we will cover cancer. First, we'll go over definitions involved in cancer, and then we'll talk about what causes cancer, finally leading up to how we can treat and possibly cure cancer. First off, I want to go over the definition of what is cancer. Cancer is uncontrolled cell division. It's when cells of the body decide to start dividing without input from the other body's tissues. They divide uncontrollably, creating large structures that can eventually kill the individual. Over 1 million people in the United States every year are diagnosed with having cancer. That's 1 million in 300 million. So 1 in 300 people every year are diagnosed. Of the 1 million people that have been diagnosed every year, 500,000 die from it. There are different kinds of cancers found in men versus women. In men, the most common cancer is prostate cancer. The prostate is an organ located just below the bladder in men, not found in women, and regulates the flow of urine during sexual intercourse. It's also involved in producing some fluid in semen and in helping push the sperm during ejaculation. So 1 in 3 of all cancers in men are prostate cancer. 10% of cancers in men, 1 in 10, are lung cancer, and nearly all of these are a result of smoking. Another 10% of cancers in men are colon cancer. The colon is essentially the large intestine and the lower portion of the gastrointestinal or digestive tract. These are the top 3 cancers found in men. Women, of course, have different cancers primarily because they don't have a prostate organ. The most common cancer found in women is breast cancer. 30% of all cancers in women are breast cancer. 10%, similar to men, are lung cancer, and 10%, again similar to men, are colon cancer. The most deadly of all cancers, in that it kills the most number of people, is lung cancer. Lung cancer accounts for 30% of all cancer deaths. And to think that nearly all of this is from smoking, you can understand why the government is so keen on regulating that activity. Here's a list of all the different types of cancers in the United States, the number of individuals diagnosed, and the number of deaths. You can see that lung cancer kills the most individuals. However, as far as mortality rate goes, you can see that lung cancer, while it does have a high mortality rate, is not quite as high as other cancers like lymphomas and leukemias. Let's talk a little bit about some vocabulary words that surround cancer. The first thing I want to cover is different types of growths or uncontrolled growths in the body. There's benign and malignant. We really don't refer to benign growths as being cancerous, whereas malignant growths are. Benign growths are when the cells grow locally and cannot spread around the body. They are also defined as having a very smooth border, and so it can be easily seen in a microscope whether or not a growth is benign or malignant by looking at the borders. These types of growths are uncontrolled and will continue until recognized and destroyed by the body or until surgically removed. But because they can't spread, they're generally not deadly, unless of course they press on vital organs such as the brain in an enclosed space like the skull. When we would talk about cancer, we're usually referring to malignant growths. Malignant cancers are when the cells grow uncontrollably and have the ability to spread to neighboring tissues, enter blood vessels, and move to different sites. Having the ability to move means they are malignant, and this can be seen because they have irregular or rough borders to the growth. It doesn't mean that they already have spread, though. That is for a different word, metastasis or metastasize. Metastasized tumors are tumors that have already spread. So you can have malignant growths that have not yet metastasized, or you can have malignant growths that have metastasized. It's after the tumor has metastasized or started spreading to other parts of the body that it becomes the deadly form of this disease. There's another way that we can distinguish between different types of cancer. We can talk about carcinomas and sarcomas. Carcinomas are cancers that start in epithelial cells, such as organs and tissues. It's always malignant, and it makes up about 85% of all diagnosed cancers. These would be your lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, and so forth. Sarcomas start in connective tissue, such as bone, fat, muscles, and blood vessels. These are not always malignant, but can result in the spreading of the cells and death depending on its location. These would be your leukemias and lymphomas. What causes cancer? So we know that cancer is uncontrolled cell division, but what causes it? Cancer is caused by mutations in our cell's DNA. It's not just one or two mutations, it's in fact an accumulation of mutations. At minimum, about 7 to a dozen or so. But usually this involves hundreds of mutations that lead to cancer. How do these mutations arise? And how do they cause cancer? Cancer, as I mentioned, is a result of uncontrolled cell division. So let's first talk about what cell division is, how cells control their cell division, and then we can talk about what happens when this goes awry. This process of cell division is what's referred to as mitosis. Mitosis is how every individual goes from a fertilized egg to an infant, to a teenager, to an adult. It's how cells divide to create a larger organism. The cell's life cycle begins just after it's made by cell division. Cell division is, as I mentioned, mitosis, and so the cell's life cycle begins here at the beginning of G1. G1, then S, and G2 are 3 different stages in a larger phase known as interphase. The rest of the cell cycle is this tiny sliver known as the mitotic phase. Interphase, as you can see here, is far, far longer of a time period than the mitotic phase, which is when the cell actually divides. G1, S, and G2 are essentially when the cell is growing in size, performing its cell duties, and engaging in its typical tissue behavior. So if it's a heart muscle cell, it will allow the heart to beat in G1, S, and G2. Only if the heart cell goes to divide will it enter the M or mitotic phase. It was initially called interphase because it looked like there was nothing going on during this entire time period, but in fact there was a lot going on. During the first stage, or G1, which initially stood for gap 1, what we actually can see is that the cell is growing in size, that it's bringing in food, producing waste, and engaging in typical cell activities. So sometimes scientists like to refer to this now as growth phase 1. Regardless, the cell will remain in G1 for most of its life. In fact, there are cells in your body that have been in G1 ever since you were born and will remain there until you die. Only if the cell receives a signal that at some point soon it will need to divide, will the cell exit G1 and enter S. S stands for synthesis, and synthesis is the DNA synthesis step of interphase. Again, the cell only enters S phase if it knows that at some point in the near future it will need to divide. During S phase, the cell is going to synthesize a copy of its DNA, a complete copy, so that when the cell goes to divide, the two resulting cells will each have one full copy of the DNA. This takes a very long time. In human cells, almost a full day. And as soon as it's done copying its DNA, the cell then enters immediately into G2. And it will remain in G2 until it receives a second signal. G2 stands initially for gap 2, but as I mentioned, could be growth phase 2 if you want to remember it that way. Because what happens during G2 is the cell is getting ready for cell division. It knows it received the signal that it will need to divide soon, and it copied its DNA. So the next thing that it knows it will be told is that it should divide now. It gets ready for cell division by getting the organelles all situated for the cell to divide in half, creating and synthesizing proteins required for the process, and generally just gearing up for the mitotic phase. When the cell receives the second signal that it needs to divide now, that's when it will exit G2 and enter the mitotic phase. By doing this, it's also exiting the interphase and exiting the mitotic phase. The mitotic phase is characterized by both mitosis and cytokinesis. Mitosis is when the nucleus divides, and cytokinesis is when the cell divides. Not all cells divide all the time. In fact, many of you listening to this lecture are adults now, and most of the cells in your body have stopped growing and dividing. Only your hair follicle cells, the cells in your nail beds, cells in your digestive system, skin, and bone marrow to generate more blood are going through this process regularly. Otherwise, most of the cells in your body do not grow and divide, or only do so when there's injury. If cells divide when they shouldn't, then you end up with uncontrolled cell division. That's what cancer is. So how do our cells know when to divide and when to stop dividing? We're going to talk about these changes that occur to result in cancer in our next segment.